Okay, we're getting there. Some technical issues that I had to sort out. So let's get started with the lecture today. Today it's going to be about broken windows, but more about that in a second. First, let me remind you, the assignment is due. It's due today. Don't ask me about the exact time, but I think it's 3 o'clock. But it is on Blackboard, right? So what is on Blackboard counts. And maybe a few things, some questions that I had received. There are several parts in this assignment, just to make sure that everybody knows. You are supposed to complete all 3 of them, and then you submit one document, with different headings, as I already mentioned last week, through Blackboard assessment. There is no maximum word limit. Minimum word limit is in the assignment, and hard copy submission is not required. The key is the online submission. In case you have any problems with either the submission or you have some other things where you think, you should deserve an extension or whatnot, don't contact me, contact our undergraduate administrator, Deirdre Brophy. She's taking care of all of these things, right? So if you send it to me, I just forward it to her anyway, so just send it to her directly. Okay, that's about the assignment, so I hope I'm looking forward to see what you guys came up with. So let's see. And let's get started with the lecture today. Today it's about broken windows. And you will hopefully see what we mean by that and how it fits into the overall thing of this lecture. Because now what we did, we talked. Actually, I think today is really not just where we pick up on lots of different pieces that we talked about in this lecture before, but we actually also apply these things in the truest analytical sociology sense. So in the second part of the lecture, I'm going to actually present some of my ongoing work that I'm currently writing, a paper that is very much an analytical sociology paper that we're going to submit over the summer, hopefully. Yeah? Okay, so about broken windows. Broken windows is a big thing in criminology. Yeah, and let's remember we talked last week about tipping points, influence, and how the one thing can lead to the other. And we had these examples of the hush puppy's shoes, or folks running around with beards, or all sorts of things like that, right? But there are other things where you could apply the same kind of thinking. And crime is a particular one, right? So in crime, we can think about what if crime. And we know this, studies show this, and this is what I'm going to talk about for most of the part of the lecture today. I'm going to present you some results where folks actually showed how eroding some norms or how some small little crime can lead to other crime following. Yeah? How disorder can spread. And so first I'm going to talk a little bit about crime and to frame the whole thing where it makes sense. So we're going to follow up on a few things that we talked about last time already. And then I'm going to introduce this broken window idea. Actually, it's called broken window theory. And within that context, I'm going to dig deeper and I'm going to present you what I think is very convincing evidence for the spread of disorder. Right? And at the end of the day, this is sort of then where my research comes into play. I want to talk to you about the age crime curve, which is one of those puzzling and most persistent findings that you find in the social sciences and in criminology in particular. It's sort of a certain relationship between age and crime. It's sort of this idea that kind of, as kids are young, there's no crime, and then it kind of peaks. It goes up dramatically in 18 to 20 years old. That's sort of where crime is the highest, and then it kind of drops down again. And people came up with all sorts of explanations for these kind of things. And, they talk about life course changes, they talk about something happening in people's life and so on. And that's all fine, but when I look at this as an analytical sociologist, I think maybe this is much simpler. And that's sort of the idea that we have in this paper, that the age crime curve, this particular pattern of increase and then decrease of crime in relation to age, might be a simple result of crime being contagious. Yeah? And that's sort of what we outline in this paper, and that's sort of our punchline that we have. And ultimately we come up with a much simpler model of the age crime curve. The only thing that we require is that something very reasonable, something that we can. A lot of other research has shown. So as soon as crime is contagious, the only other assumption we need to make is that young kids or younger individuals are more susceptible to social influence than older individuals. Right? I'm introducing some heterogeneity with age. It's a very simple relationship like this. Young kids are more likely to follow others, to imitate others than older ones. And when we have these two components, we call that selective influence, and crime being contagious, the age crime curve is the natural outcome of that. That's sort of the macro level outcome of it. Yeah? That's sort of analytical sociology. We have the macro level outcome that we want to explain, and we explain it through the actions and the interactions of the individuals. So let's see how this goes. But this is sort of some work that I'm currently writing up. Okay, so let's talk about crime. Now, crime has sort of this fascinating thing. I don't know. I'm fascinated by crime. To study crime, I think it's very, very interesting. And people had all sorts of ideas. There are all sorts of theories out there why some people commit crime. Something psychological. Others say, they will become criminal eventually, while others then say it's the social context that matters. And here we are. Here we sort of can make the relation to the things that we talked about before. What about social influence? Now, what about social influence playing a role here? That maybe crime is contagious, right? I'm putting it out there, but later on I'm going to show you some evidence that it actually seems to be the case. Okay, and now let's take that for a moment, that crime is contagious, and what would that imply? Well, last week I talked about these tipping points, right? About how something can suddenly change, right? They go on, and then suddenly there are enough people, and then the whole system gets into another state. There's sort of this phase transition, and there's sort of this regime change. That's what we call, there's a tipping point, and then it flips from the one to the other. And maybe crime can be seen in that light. Yeah? And that's sort of the suggestion that is out there. And actually, people thought about that, in the late 80s, in the 90s, early 90s, when this idea of tipping points became popular for the first time. It really changed the way that cities organized their policing. In the States, remember I showed you this graph where the crime rate dropped dramatically. Crime rate dropped dramatically in the early 90s. People were not really sure about what it was. But some people thought it's related to a drastic change in the way policing was organized and policing worked. Basically, it was a tremendous effort of zero tolerance, like a crackdown on even the smallest kinds of crime, or the smallest things, like, some people, just doing something really petty, something very small. And they cracked really hard on that. So people were sent in prison for the smallest infractions. And the idea here was that maybe this prevents other crime from happening, which then prevents other crime from happening, which then prevents other crime from happening. Okay? So that was sort of this idea. But I have a little video that kind of shows this to you, hopefully clearer. So that's sort of the thing that we observed. In the early 90s, the crime rate really dropped down. Sort of this big puzzle. Why did that happen? And, when you look at actually what had happened at the time, there was this effort to a zero-tolerance policing strategy on the smallest stuff. Yeah? But interestingly, the big stuff also dropped down. Okay, so this is where we are, and now the theory comes into play. What were those guys thinking? They didn't just crack down on these things for no reason. There was actually some serious thinking about that, and it goes actually back. This whole idea of broken windows goes back to this. Hey, funny story. I tried to find a video, but I couldn't find one. There didn't exist one. In the 1960s, there was this guy Zimbardo, who was actually a social psychologist. And he parked this car, in the late 1960s. He parked this car in the middle of the Bronx in New York, and he threw in one of the windows of the car. And then within 24 hours, the whole car disintegrated. It just disappeared. People came and ripped out certain pieces and certain parts of the car. Right? While he did the same thing, he parked the car in Palo Alto in California, outside the campus in Stanford, and nothing happened for the longest time. Right? And when he described about what's called the Lucifer effect, if you want to read up on it, he wrote a book. It's called the Lucifer effect. Zimbardo. So when he wrote this up, he described how in New York, very quickly, sort of actually, a family passed by, a father, a mother, and a little kid, and they kind of were the first one to open up the car and to, I don't know what they took out, the battery or something like that, took out the hood, and then other people followed. And then other people came along and thought, okay, it's open, there's already the battery out, let's screw the wheels off, and within 24 hours the whole thing disappeared. I don't know, just the bare minimum of the car remained. Well, this builds on this idea of broken windows. So broken windows, or broken window theory, goes back to these criminologists, Wilson and Kelly, who suggested that signs of disorder like broken windows, litter, graffiti, induce other types of disorder and petty crime. The idea is that people observe some sort of crime or some norms being broken, some disorder, and that kind of makes them more likely to conduct some disorder themselves. The idea is the floodgates get opened, right? People kind of see others already don't adhere to the rules. Why should I adhere to the rules? And then it was thought that removing these signs of disorder would take away an important trigger of criminal behavior. And that's sort of where this theory with the New York police came into play, but in the little video I have, this becomes even clearer what they did, because they really started to scrubbing off all the graffiti in the subways. They would wonder why should this reduce crime, right? But according to this theory, it would. Right? Because there's sort of a sign that a certain norm, it's called a contextual norm, is being broken, right? And then as a result of that, a target norm is more likely to get broken as well. But I come back to that in the context of the experiments where I demonstrate to you these kind of things. But the basic idea really is that this, on the one side, throwing down one piece of rubbish, this one, what could I do? I could just, there's no rubbish bin, what should I do? I could just drop it here, right? And what does it do? It kind of really shows to others, well, apparently it seems to be all right to drop this here. While if I would take it away and with me, then others would have to make this, others would be the first one here as well, right? The idea is that when people are not the first one to breach a certain norm or to breach an orderly behavior, they are more likely to breach it when they're the second, the third, and so on, when they have others they can refer to and say, well, others already did it. I just did what the dude in front of me did. I'm just left my rubbish here because he did. So that's sort of this idea of some contextual norms being broken, leading to other norms being broken. And you see how this relates to the stuff that we talked about already before. Right? It was all about social influence, how, remember the yawning that we had here, or other examples. And then when we add these things together, it actually can, especially with last lecture where we talked about thresholds, and how the one can lead to the next, to the next, and the next, and the next, and so on, how this can build up. And at the end, we have a wild mob of people rioting, right? So the idea here really is that this can happen with something like throwing rubbish away as well. Yeah? So I have a little video that I want to show you. Let's see if the sound works out. The sound is always a little crappy here. I don't know why. But that demonstrates this idea of broken windows a little more to you.
Three days before Christmas, 1984, Bernie Goetz boarded the number 2 train in Manhattan and sat down next to 4 young African Americans. When the teenagers tried to hustle him for money, something inside Goetz snapped. He pulled out a Smith & Wesson .38 and opened fire, shooting down all 4 men. Bernie Goetz personified the community of fear that was New York in the 1980s. Politicians had tried reform after reform to stem the flow of crime through the streets of New York, but nothing was working. street conditions indicated that anything was possible for criminals. Surrounded by unpunished crime, Goetz felt justified taking on the vigilante mantle. In the process, he became a criminal himself. But everything changed in New York when two revolutionary thinkers arrived on the scene, David Grund and William Braden. In the late 80s and early 90s, they adopted a new approach to crime, cracking down on misdemeanors like vandalism and fare beating in the subway system. They scrubbed trains for graffiti, repainted them, and maintained a zero-tolerance policy for other small crimes. If you peed in the street, said Braden, you were going to jail. Why adopt harsh measures towards small crimes when serious criminal activity was the deeper issue? Because sometimes the smallest things can act as a tipping point for something massive. By suffocating minor crime, Braden and Grund were experimenting with the idea by criminologists James Wilson and George Kelly, called broken windows theory. Broken windows theory says that perception of disorder in the community plays a huge role in the spread of crime. One broken window signals to a community that no one cares. So what's to keep people from breaking another? This is the sort of neighborhood where you can get away with crime. When no one cares about little things, bigger things happen. Crime grows and spreads like an infection. Consider yawning. Have you noticed how when one person yawns in a room, everyone feels sleeping? A yawn can act as an idea planted in your brain by someone else's action. Crime can be like a yawn. It's contagious. The smallest trigger can set someone off. Like Bernie Goetz. In New York in the 80s, Goetz was surrounded by crime and disorder. Crossed one too many times on a dirty subway in a neighborhood where no one cared. He pulled the trigger. But it was just around that time that Braden, Grund, and others began to take broken windows seriously. In 1990, New York had recorded 2,605 homicides. Over the next 5 years, under strict cleanup policies, crime rates plummeted. By 1997, the number of homicides was cut in half. The theory seems to work, but of course, disorder isn't the sole cause of crime, and community cleanup isn't the full solution either. There are 100 factors. Sometimes the issue of crime seems insurmountable, but broken windows theory says that if we just tackle the details, the landscape of crime might tip. We can fix broken windows and take ownership of the dark corners of our neighborhoods. We've always been told to pick up trash to keep our community beautiful, but perhaps if we pick up trash, we can help make our community safe too.
Okay, so I wanted to show you this because I think it's a very good illustration. So I'm going to pick up my trash. Right? I'm going to take it with me. There you go. Going to dispose it properly. And this is sort of a very powerful suggestion, right? That we can actually change, we can actually have a big impact on something as important as the number of people getting killed, right? And by changing small little things, I think that's kind of good, right? So actually, we can have an impact. We can change the world. I believe in that. We can change the world when we start with the small things, right? Even when we think it's just a small little step, we need to think about all the things that kind of follow up on this, right? So I don't know. I tell you something about something. Maybe you tell others, right? And maybe you then they tell others, and they inspire others, and so on and so forth. And this is how we change the way we think about stuff. Or this is how we change how certain problems are, or how we solve certain things in our world. But you see how the implications of this can be very powerful, very fascinating. But we need to make sure: is it actually truly the case? Is it truly the case that there's sort of this contagiousness of things happening? Right? That's sort of the micro foundation. Remember, we think about the boat that we are. We need to get the micro foundations right. Is it truly the case that kind of disorder spreads like that? Right? But that's something we can study. It's actually incredibly hard. But some of my colleagues did some, not here, but colleagues in Groningen and in the Netherlands, they did some fascinating experiments about that, to study how, or if it is the case, that disorder spreads. Yeah? So they did this in Groningen. A good friend of mine, he's a professor in Groningen. They have a fantastic sociology department, great master's and PhD program as well. So those guys know what they're doing. And there's a paper, it ended up in Science. That was the reading for today. It was a short little paper, and when you read it, you saw it's actually not that complicated. It's actually very simple. It's very straightforward. And that's sort of the beauty of these experimental studies. They are sort of very, very straightforward. They're sort of often just a control condition and a treatment condition. Two things, two different groups, and then it's been compared, and the difference is due to the treatment that we have. So there are actually they did 6 different experiments, but I'm going to talk about 4 of them in a little more detail to kind of demonstrate this evidence that is out there for the spreading of disorder. Right? Okay, so the question that they had in their study or in these different experiments was does giving cues that one norm is broken, and that's sort of what they call the contextual norm, lead to other norms being broken as well. And so people observe one thing that is where people violate a certain kind of norm. Does it lead to them breaking another kind of norm? And that's sort of the idea. And if that is the case, well, then we are sort of on board. That's sort of at the core of what broken window theory suggests, right? And although this is so convincing, it has been really hard for people to test this. Yeah? Because how do you test this? How do you throw in windows and I don't know, what are you going to do? But actually here in this study, they more or less did that. They threw in windows and they looked at how many people then throw in some other windows later on as well, right? Like a metaphorical sense, but you will see is not too far off. Because what they did, they actually sprayed graffiti at the walls. How cool is that? There's kind of guys like me, and on a Saturday evening they get paid to spray some graffiti at some wall in the Netherlands, right? And it's all part of the name of science. And it turns out to be an awesome experiment, and it even ends up in Science, one of the 2 top journal publications that we have over all the disciplines, over all the academic disciplines. So how did this work? Well, first of all, remember there was sort of the contextual norm and the target norm. The target norm, that's sort of what they want to observe. That's sort of the thing. Do people break that at the end of the day? And where they looked at littering. Yeah, littering is sort of taking rubbish and throwing it on the floor. That's the idea. That's sort of ultimately what they looked at and what they counted. How many times do people throw something on the floor? That was sort of this norm. Does it get broken? And the contextual norm that they broke was graffiti. But you'll see in a second how this looked like. Yeah. So, those guys, they are in the Netherlands, these colleagues of mine, and what do you do in the Netherlands? Well, you cycle around on your bike. That's sort of what people do. If you've ever been to the Netherlands, bikes everywhere, it's fucking dangerous because they're sort of cycling like crazy, and you walk around and you don't know what to do, and they're just mad. But everybody is cycling around, right? And what they did, they attached little flyers to bikes that were parked in front of the sociology, or I don't think it was in the sociology department, somewhere in the middle of Groningen. Yeah? And they had these little flyers. They made sure that it was actually a really crappy flyer, and it was sort of a fake company that wished everybody happy holidays. Yeah? And that's sort of what they attached to the bike. And here you actually see how it looked like. Yeah? So there's sort of these bikes that are standing there, next to the wall. They're being parked, and then you see these white little pieces of paper that are being attached to the bikes. Right? So that's sort of what the starting conditions look like. And then there was no rubbish bin nearby. There was no rubbish bin nearby. What are you going to do with this crappy piece of paper? You cannot cycle away with that because it's just in the middle of everything. Right? So people need to remove it. But now the question is, do people stash it away, or do they drop it on the floor? That's sort of the key thing. Do people drop it on the floor, or do they take it with them? And now you see where I'm going with this, how they kind of changed this contextual norm. And like one day, actually it was the same day of the week, they conducted this experiment, they attached these flyers to the bikes, And then they had, somebody, folks like you that helped them in doing this study, observing how many people threw these pieces of paper on the floor. Right? So they had a certain amount of time, and they looked at how many people go to pick up their bikes and how many of them threw these flyers on the floor. That was what they measured at the end of the day. And then, one Saturday evening, they went out in the middle of the night and they sprayed graffiti at this wall. And everything, it was legal, it was all, went through the university board, it was all agreed and so on. But that was sort of this thing where they then broke the contextual norm. Notice how there's a sign, no graffiti. Right? There's a sign, no graffiti, and then obviously next to it there is graffiti. So that's sort of the cue that they're giving here, that somebody else seemed to have already broken the norm. But they, as researchers, did it. And that's sort of what we do when we do experimental studies. We sort of administer a certain treatment. Right? So we are in control of that. And then we can actually, if we do observe differences, we know that it must be due to our treatment. Because that's the only thing that is different. Everything else is sort of the same setup. Right? Now, actually, when they talk about how they did it, they even say that they paid efforts to make really crappy graffiti in the middle of the night, so that it wouldn't falsely considered to be art. Graffiti can be really cool, but they put up some really crappy stuff, and now we have these two conditions. We have the order condition with no graffiti at the wall, where the norm that there shouldn't be any graffiti at the wall is being followed. Right? That's sort of the sign. And then we have the second one, that what they call the disorder condition, where there is a sign that there shouldn't be graffiti at the wall, but obviously there is graffiti at the wall. Right? When we look at the experimental setup, this is sort of how it looks like. And this is how these experimental setups look like. There's something that you do to everybody, and then you funnel them into a control and into a treatment group. Now, some people ended up in the order condition, there was no graffiti at the wall, and other people ended up in the disorder condition, where there was graffiti at the wall when they went there and were about to pick up their bikes. And then at the end, you see how simple and beautiful these kind of things are, because then all they needed to do is to compare the numbers of how many people dropped down the flyers on the floor. Right? And then by looking at the difference, then you can tell that it must be due to the graffiti at the wall, because nothing else has happened. Right? That's sort of the only change, that's sort of the only treatment that was being administered. Okay, so this is sort of the setup. Now let's look at the results. What came out of this? It was striking. Look at these numbers. Right? Like in the order condition, 33% of the people threw the flyer onto the floor. While as soon as there was the graffiti at the wall, there was no reason why suddenly there should be more norm-breaking people that kind of go and pick up their bikes. But with the graffiti at the wall, something had happened, right? And then suddenly almost 70% of the people threw the flyer on the floor. And the idea here is that, and I think it's very convincing evidence, and kind of it shows that there's sort of this contextual norm being broken, and that this leads to other norms being more breakable as well. Okay, so that was one of the experiments that they had. It's a very, you can do some statistical tests on this, but this is so obvious. This is such a huge difference here that we observe by having the graffiti at the wall, by changing the whole situation about how people break another norm. They did a whole bunch of other experiments along the similar lines. And these are all field experiments, right? So this is sort of stuff that, this is stuff that you guys could do. Yeah? There's nothing overly fancy about it, but there's kind of this thinking behind it. And the next study was about attaching bikes to certain fences. Yeah. So let me describe you the setup. Basically, they went to this parking lot in the middle of Groningen in the Netherlands. It's a beautiful city up there in the north of the Netherlands, not too far away from the North Sea. I can highly recommend to visit. So there was a parking lot where people had parked their bikes. And what they did, the researchers, the colleagues of mine, they set up a fence around this parking lot. Yeah? They set up a fence around this parking lot, and they put up certain signs to this fence. So the first sign on the left, geen doorgang, it's Dutch. It means no trespassing. People are not allowed to walk through. But then you see they have a little gap in the fence. right? A small gap of 50 centimeters where people could actually squeeze through. The alternative would be, and that's also what the sign shows, is that they should walk 200 meters around, right, to get to the main entrance of the parking lot. But obviously they could walk through to get directly to their car. And then, so that's at the end of the day the target norm, that they are looking at how many people walk through this gap in the fence. And then next to it, there's this other sign, again feeds in, Anhalt was maken. My Dutch is a little rusty, but it basically says, don't attach bikes to this fence. Don't lock your bike to this fence. It's not allowed. That's a contextual norm that they will break in their experimental setup. So the first one, that's sort of ultimately what they measure. How many people walk through this gap in the fence, although there's a sign that people shouldn't walk through. And then the thing that they change, where their treatment is, that they're going to attach bikes to the fence to deliberately break this contextual norm and to see if that increases the number of people that walk through the gap in the fence. So at the end, we have sort of these two conditions, and that's sort of how these experiments look like. As I said, there's always a control and a treatment condition. Sometimes there are more treatment conditions, it becomes a little more complicated. But that's sort of the basic idea. And in the order condition, they had 4 bikes standing next to the fence, locked in a normal way, right? While in the disorder conditions, they had 4 bikes attached to the fence, locked to the fence, obviously breaking the norm of what the sign there said. Right? Again, all in the name of science. Here's sort of the setup, how it looks like. People approach this gap in the fence, and then some of them at certain times of the week, they end up in the order condition where 4 bikes stand 1 meter away from the fence and are locked. And then some other times, at comparable days of the week, people approach this parking lot. There's the same gap in the fence, but then there are 4 bikes attached to the fence. Okay, and what happened? Well, the results were striking. Again. More than twice the number of people walked through the gap in the fence when there were these spikes attached to it. Right? So in the order conditions, there were only 27% of the people that walked through the gap in the fence, while in the disorder condition, there were 82% people walking through this gap in the fence. What does it tell us? Well, that apparently, that kind of breaking one norm makes people more likely, or seeing others having broken a norm already, seems to make people more likely to break yet another norm. Sort of this idea of the floodgates. You go somewhere and people don't seem to care. Why should you care? Right? Why should you care about the sign? Others don't really care about the signs that are attached there. And sort of this, I think, some convincing evidence for this idea of spreading of disorder. So they had a third experiment that I want to talk about. Again, sort of similar setup, but the study is very powerful because they did these different experiments and all of them had very, very clear results along these lines. And what they did in this study, again, they looked at littering, but now they went into a parking garage. Now there was a parking garage of a fitness center and a supermarket, and they attached these crappy flyers under the windshields of the cars. Yeah? And again, there were sort of no rubbish bins around. There were signs that you shouldn't litter, don't throw things on the floor. But they measured how many people actually throw it on the floor. That was sort of the target norm where they looked at how many people to break that. Yeah? And what was their experimental setup? Well, this is actually a picture of this parking garage, how it looked like in Groningen. And the experimental condition was to have unreturned shopping carts standing around in this parking garage. Right? There were also clear signs that you should return your shopping carts, right, to the supermarket or wherever you pick them up. But sometimes people are lazy; they just leave it there. They just go, right, and think it's somebody else's problem, or maybe somebody else, I don't know, is happy about the shopping cart. But if everybody would do it, it would complete breakdown. The parking garage wouldn't work anymore. So those guys, I just have to think about how they actually did it. They were just standing in this parking garage one afternoon, kind of sneaking in and putting these shopping carts in position, and then hiding somewhere, and then watching the people going to their cars. Right? And that's some very serious research. You actually see how it relates to the important question about whether this could be a way, or this sort of influence could be a way to reduce crime rates, or reduce the number of people getting killed and whatnot. Right? But we need to be sure about the micro foundations. Like, is it really the case that disorder spreads? So, yeah, this is sort of their setup. Again, they had the ordered condition, same sort of story, where there was no unreturned shopping carts in this parking garage. So they make sure that it's clean, that all the shopping carts are being returned. And then they watched how many people throw away the flyer they found on the windshield of their car. And in the second condition, the disorder condition, they sneaked in and they placed these shopping carts next to some carts, unreturned shopping carts, breaking the contextual norm very obviously. And then they looked how many people throw down the flyer that they found attached to the windshields of their car. So here we are. So that's sort of the setup. It's very straightforward. Again, some people end up in the order condition, some people end up in the disorder condition, where there are these unreturned shopping carts. In both cases, they count the number of flyers that people throw on the floor, and then they compare them with each other. What was the result? Again, almost double the people littered when this contextual norm was broken. Something simple as the shopping carts standing around there seemed to make people more likely to not care about the flyer and to also throw it onto the floor. Right. So it's not a small effect, that's sort of a big one, right? So like breaking a small infraction on something that is not even related to the flyers, right? There are no other flyers at the floor. That's actually how we talked about social influence so far, right? That I don't know, some people think a song is very popular or whatnot. In this case, like others obviously throw something on the floor and then others would follow. Here it's actually even something else. Like it's another norm that is being broken, which leads to people not seeming to care about whether or not they throw the flyer onto the floor. Okay, so the fourth study in this context, and that's actually the one that I like the most, they went to mailboxes. Like a public mailbox in the Netherlands, in Groningen. Imagine you walk by, like a mailbox, and you see an envelope sticking out of this mailbox. And in this envelope, there's sort of a little window in there. There's obviously money in it. Right? But that thing was planted by these colleagues of mine. So they set it up like that. Right? They put sort of this envelope into the mailbox so that it would stick out and that people would obviously see the money in there. Now the question is, how many people steal the money? That was sort of part of the experiment here, right? So instead of counting how many people threw down the flyer on the floor, now they actually counted how many people stole the money, how many people took away the money. Well, actually, it was fake money in this envelope, right? They didn't have that much research funding that to do this on a large scale. They could just have people stealing the money. So they used fake money, and they actually described how tricky it was to get good fake money, to make it look like real, right? It had to be credible. If it would be obviously fake money, why would people actually bother to go and open this, right? Okay. And then now let's go to the conditions that they had. In this case, it was a little more complicated. But let's start off. They had the order condition. There was sort of a neat mailbox. There was nothing around. It was all clean. And the envelope was sticking out of the mailbox. But now they had two disorder conditions. One was where they actually deliberately placed some rubbish, some litter around this mailbox. So they placed rubbish around this mailbox to show how, this is a fucked up world. This is sort of, all lost, all gone, like in the picture in the middle, right? So they deliberately placed rubbish around that. And in the second disorder condition, they did the same thing with the rubbish, but on the top of that, they put some graffiti onto the mailbox. Again, all in the name of science, but all within this experimental setup. So here we are. So again, it's sort of Looks familiar? This is sort of how the setup was, the envelope with the money, and then some people ended up in the order condition. That was sort of a certain day of the week where there was no littering next to the mailbox, and then some other people on another day, a comparable day of the week, people ended up in the disorder condition where there was littering and or graffiti next to the mailbox. And ultimately, they just count how many people stole the letter from people that went there and obviously saw it. Yeah. So in all these experiments, there was, I tried to think about it, somebody must have been hiding somewhere, looking at, or I don't know if they had cameras or whatnot, to observe what is actually happening. What were the results? Well, again, you see this is very, very clear. This is twice as many people stole the money when there was littering next to the mailbox. And even more people stole the money when there was not just the littering, but there was also graffiti on the mailbox. So I think these are very, very convincing evidence for the spreading of disorder. The spreading of disorder. The kind of breaking one norm or some non-normative behavior can lead to other non-normative behavior when people pick it up. Sort of now makes us more comfortable in this whole idea of broken windows, right? That kind of the behaviors of some individuals breaking some laws can lead to other individuals breaking some laws as well. Okay, let me now talk a little bit for the last 5 minutes about some of my ongoing research, where I apply this kind of thinking. Right now we are here. Now I just established crime seems to be contagious. Now let's add this together with what we know about analytical sociology and think about the macro level implications. Right? So it's about the relationship between age and crime, but I come back to that in a second. That's basically just the paper that we are just currently preparing, and because it's because I think it's a very powerful point that we are making, we hope to get this into AGS this summer. What is the starting point? So far, people did not really think about the macro-level implications of crime being contagious. The macro-level implications. Remember, this is where we started with analytical sociology. We want to think about what are the macro-level outcomes. Segregation, inequality, like a whole society behaving in a certain way. And something that we observe for societies as a whole. And one of the key points, that I'm kind of pushing here very hard is that, what we have at the macro level, what we observe at the population, is not necessarily, we cannot necessarily conclude, and that's sort of what one of the assignments was all about, that we cannot draw conclusions about the individuals from that. Why am I saying that? Because all of these things that I've been talking about here for the last few weeks, social influence, tipping points, thresholds, right? One behavior leading to the other, and so on and so forth, right? Which can produce macro level patterns that even no single individual wants. Right? We can end up, and we'll talk about that on Thursday, but then more after the break, we can end up in a world that is extremely segregated. People live in completely different parts of a city or of the world, while in fact everybody wants to live in an integrated world. So there we have a macro level outcome that is sort of comes about from the actions and the interactions of individuals that might have completely different preferences. But because they all interact with each other, they are interdependent on each other, there's sort of these cascades effects that can happen, which then leads to a completely vastly different macro level outcome. So, in criminology or, in the sociology of crime, one of the biggest puzzles that people have is sort of this thing. That's sort of what we call the age crime curve. You see on the one axis, on the x-axis, the age of individuals. On the y-axis, you see the crimes per population. And that's what I talked about. That's sort of this peak. It's around, here it's sort of 16, 17, 18, goes really up, and then it dies off. Then it goes down again. And that's sort of a pattern that is found, that is very prevalent. It's prevalent, I don't know, for the last 40 years where people studied these kind of things. They found it all over. They found it all over the world. They found it for all types of crime. So this is sort of a macro level pattern. This is a macro level pattern. This is not about individuals. This is a macro level pattern. We observe there's a certain relationship in the population between age and crime. Notice how I'm making the distinction now between individuals being more or less likely to commit certain crime, and the macro level pattern that we observe. Because what we do observe is the macro level pattern. We observe this is the number of people who commit crime at a certain age. Right? Now I'm applying this idea of analytical sociology that maybe this does not necessarily tell me about individuals, single individuals, being more or less likely to commit crime at a certain age. Right? So this age crime curve is sort of very prevalent. As I said, it has been found all around the world. People did these studies. It has been found for all types of offenses. Now, this is sort of now different offense types, like burglary, rape, robbery. For all of them, it's maybe sometimes a little different, but sort of the pattern looks strikingly similar. So this seems to be an incredibly universal phenomenon. And actually people say this is the most important empirical regularity that we find in criminology. Something that we just find everywhere for all types of things. How do people explain it so far? Well, surprisingly in a very unsatisfactory way. So people come up with all these stories that there's something happening biosocial in people's brain at this age, or they talk about self-control or social control or life course issues, and that sort of people, something happens at the end of their adolescence, and then they become adults and so on. And these are all valid explanations, but they leave us in an unsatisfied way, because they all require sort of this thing, why should it go up and then it should go down again and so on, right? So when I look at these kind of patterns and the kind of the readings I do and the stuff that I like, we had this idea. Doesn't that look like something being the outcome of the diffusion, of a diffusion process, of a contagiousness, right? And so at the core of the idea that we have is two things. We think we treat crime as contagious. Right? I showed you with the broken window stuff that actually that seems to be the case. So that some behavior, some crime leads to other crime. People imitate criminal behavior, and then the second piece of the puzzle that we add in here is something else that psychologists, child development researchers found, is that younger kids are more likely to get influenced by others than older kids. Now, I'm not talking about crime or anything. It's just really about individuals' propensity to resist social pressure, to resist social influence, right? And this is sort of now a much simpler assumption, because now what I'm saying is all we need is to think of it in such a way. We don't need to think of something going up and going down again. All we need to think about is sort of a monotonically declining your function, something like that. You can model it in whatever way. But the core is that younger kids are more likely to get influenced by others than older individuals. And when we add these two pieces of the puzzle together, that's sort of our contribution, why I think it's a very powerful contribution. Because when you have these two pieces of the puzzle, then the age crime curve naturally follows from that. If you want to read more about that, I have the paper, but there's sort of some crazy math in there. We throw around some differential equations. We use some modeling from how people used to model diseases in a way. Yeah, but the basic idea, this is sort of what our model comes out with. And when you look at that, it looks remarkably similar to the empirical patterns. And now I'm not making any assumptions about something going up and down. All I'm making is two things. Crime is contagious. And the second one, younger kids are more susceptible to social influence than older individuals. Throwing these things together leads to this pattern. How does that happen? Well, the story is a very simple one. Think about kids being young and being highly susceptible to social influence, right? So they listen to what others do. But there are no criminals yet. So they would copy the behavior of other criminals, but there are no criminals. Right? And then some of them become criminals, which leads then to others copying the behavior, which leads to this massive increase because they copy the behavior. But then after a while, some people recover and whatnot, and it's all part of this paper that we have, that people aren't criminals forever. And they drop out, and then there are lots of criminals around, but then at a later age, people are not susceptible to it anymore. They sort of resist to this pressure. And so these two things together two things together, crime being contagious and the what we call it selective influence, or the declining susceptibility to social influence with age, leads to the pattern that we observe. And that's sort of an example of what analytical sociology at the end of the day is, explaining macro-level outcomes through the actions and the interactions of the individuals that we have here. Anyway, so that's about it for today. For Thursday, let's get started with segregation, but we might do a little review of the things we did so far as well. Okay, thanks so much.